Hello and welcome to the Merseyside Junior Lawyers Division podcast. We're here for a 4-part series sponsored by the University of Law. My name is Laura Keane and I'm the current Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Representative for the MGLD Committee. I'm also a trainee solicitor at In-House Legal Solutions. I'm joined today by Lauren Cannon, Director and co-founder of In-House Legal Solutions, and today we are going to be talking about all things to do with commercial awareness in law. Lauren, it's so lovely to sit down and talk with you today. I just thought I'd start by asking you what your own personal route into law was.
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, so my route into law was, it followed a traditional pathway, certainly to begin with. So I did a law degree. I studied law at Gonville and Caius College in Cambridge. And it was in my second year that I applied for some vacation schemes. So at the time, we were quite heavily marketed by some of the bigger firms, some of the Magic Circle law firms. So in the summer of my second year, I did a vacation scheme with Magic Circle firm called Allen & Overy, who's recently changed his name to A&O Shearman. And I did a placement there, which I think was quite a while ago now, lasted about 2 months. And at the end of that placement, we were offered the opportunity to interview for a training contract. So I took that opportunity and I found out a couple of months later that I was offered a training contract at A&O. And at that point, it was 2003. And I was offered the training contract to start in 2006, which when you're in your second year of university, you think will never come around. So I'd signed up the dotted line, not really knowing what I wanted to do in terms of my legal career, what areas of law I went into. But I signed up anyway and sort of hoped for the best. And in the interim, I went to Nottingham Law School to do my legal practice course. That at the time was sponsored by A&O, which I think is still sometimes the practice of law firms today. So if you've already secured your training contract, they will fund your route into the LPC, albeit these days things are slightly different with the move to the SQE. So I completed my year at Nottingham Law School, took a little bit of time off to go travelling, and I went travelling around Africa, where I did some volunteering in some animal charities and essentially looked after lions for about 6 weeks before travelling around the rest of Africa and over to Hong Kong. And eventually that March 2006 date did actually come around, and I realised I did have to actually go to work. So I went to Allen & Overy and I did my training contract for 2 years, and I was in the corporate department to begin with, and I was completely new to the law, not really knowing what I was going to do and what I was letting myself in for. I then spent some time in employment, incentives and pensions, and after that I went to the banking team, which was my third seat, and I enjoyed that a lot. It was sort of 2006 was before the credit crunch. There was a high level of activity in the financial world. It was a busy time. I went on secondment to Milan to work in A&O's banking team over there, and then ultimately qualified into that team, where I then worked as an associate for a number of years.
And law firms will talk about candidates needing to demonstrate commercial awareness. What does that kind of buzzword mean? What would you say commercial awareness means?
So commercial awareness is a really tricky one to define, and I think personally it means different things to different people, which is really hard because when you go for a interview with a law firm or a business, or you're writing an application, you will very likely be asked to either talk about what commercial awareness you have or to demonstrate it in some way. Broadly speaking, my view is it means having an understanding of what is happening in the world and how that impacts the work that you'd be doing if you were in that firm or that business. It can mean different things to different people. If you're working in a very large business that does a lot of commercial or corporate work, it's about being able to apply world events, which might be geopolitical events, it might be what's happening in the news, it might be what's happening in the industry of solicitors, and it's applying what is happening and how that will impact your working day but also the working day of your clients.
And at In-House Legal Solutions, where you are director and I am a trainee solicitor, we obviously use commercial awareness. I'd say I use commercial awareness, and I have to be commercially aware every single day, especially because of the area of law that we work in. We work in commercial law, corporate law, especially for a range of clients in the financial services sector. How do you personally see and use commerciality in your day-to-day of running IHLS, dealing with clients, and just generally being a lawyer?
I agree. I think we use it every day, almost without realising it somehow. Mm-hmm. When you first start out in your legal career, it's often new. You might be someone who's really interested in the news and politics, or you might not. You might have been really interested in the academic study of law and have been less interested or had less exposure to what's going on in the wider political sphere. I think that is the time to start really thinking about what do I need to know for when I work in a law firm or work in a legal business. When you start out, you will sort of start realising that what's going on in the world does directly impact the running of law firms as a business. And I think people forget or maybe don't realise at the start that law firms themselves are businesses. They have to be profit making in order to survive. And by profit making with any sort of financial services business, the key asset is people. People are the most important part of running a financial services or legal or professional services business. And knowing what's going on in the world and how that impacts people and how it impacts clients is absolutely key. So in terms of day-to-day running of business, I'm looking at things right now about the general election. So we know there's going to be a general election at some point in 2024. We don't know when. We also know there's going to be a US election. Both of those things will have impacts on the clients' businesses that we act for. They'll have impacts on our businesses. So, for example, a lot of the time when elections are announced, investors in financial markets will take a step back, and they won't necessarily want to do deals until they have more certainty on what the political landscape will look like. So in the first half of a year, where we don't know when the election is, we're very likely to see a lot of activity in the legal world and in the financial world. When an election is announced, the run-up to it, there may be a halt or a pause on that until people know what the political landscape is going to look like, what laws might be passed, what changes there might be in terms of employment law, in terms of legislation that either works in favour of businesses or works against businesses, particularly foreign investment. And whilst there is that nervousness, deal activity will often pause. It typically picks up again once there is more certainty. But as a business owner, I have to keep an eye on that and make sure that in terms of resourcing, we're still getting that right. In terms of financials, we've planned ahead. We've planned for deal activity to be busy, but also for moments where it's a bit quieter. And all law firms and all businesses will go through these cycles. And it's about knowing what the markets are doing and how that impacts your day-to-day life is how you manage business risk.
And I know you mentioned about elections and how that has a big impact on deal activity, and it's something that we saw as well a couple of years ago with the Ukraine war, and how our clients and other investors across Europe became quite apprehensive to invest, to buy, to sell. So all of these kind of geopolitical events, they do have such an impact on legal work and just general commercial awareness as well. So what tips would you have for students who may want to develop their own commercial awareness? Are there any websites or podcasts or other kind of media or press sources that you would recommend to those students listening that would help broaden their commercial awareness?
Yes, absolutely. I think the key is that there is so much out there, and it is the best way to approach it is to find out what the right resource is that works for you, what you can digest well, and what gives you the best information about what's out there. In terms of tips to start with, my tip would be to be interested. That sounds so basic, but it's really key, because if you are interested in what's going on and how it's going to affect your work, how it's going to affect your clients, you'll be much more likely to want to learn and want to know what's going on. If it's not of interest to you, it may well be that you might want to look at a different area of the law that perhaps is a bit more academic, rather than looking at the areas of law where political events and news events impact quite heavily. Because as you'll find during your career, the landscape of the world changes, and it's about being ahead of that change and ahead of the curve that helps you manage your own success. In terms of sort of sources like websites and podcasts, I'll start off by potentially saying what I suggest you don't do. And I've seen lots of examples of people who come to us in interviews and we say, how do you keep on top of commercial awareness? And often you find the answer is, I look on social media. And I would always warn away from just relying on only looking at social media, for the reason that social media, worst case, is potentially incorrect or fake news. But perhaps more subtle is that people have opinions on social media, and opinions can be wrongly informed. They don't necessarily reflect the reality of the world. And if you're drawn into something which doesn't necessarily look at both arguments and weighing it up, it may not be a good starting point for you to then discuss that, in an application or an interview. That's not to say that social media can't be useful. I think it's just making sure your sources are reputable and sources that are backed by evidence. People get really worried that being commercially aware means you have to read the Financial Times. I think if you do read the Financial Times, or you enjoy that level of detail, it's a good place to start. So it's not to take away from that, but people find it hard to digest. There are other news sources that are potentially a bit more sort of straightforward. The BBC News and the BBC Business Pages are really good. And even just having the BBC News app on your phone is a good starting point, because it gives you a real independent sort of overview of what's happening day to day. Again, that can either be on social media or it can be going on the website itself. So that's a good place to start. Podcasts are also really helpful. Again, making sure you are choosing one that's that's good, it's got good backing. The Economist, the magazine, which I think is mostly online now, they do a good podcast, as do the Business Daily podcasts. Sometimes there are programs on Radio 4, which often, sound a bit like what old people listen to. But actually, some of their programs are quite topical, and they're a good way to get you to think about topics that you might not have thought about before. So that's, there's lots out there, but it's about being wary and looking in the right places. There's other areas where you can find out information about what's going on in the legal world itself. So AI and tech is a really good way to have a look at an area which is pervading most lawyers and their lives and what they need to do day to day at the moment. And there's so much out there on legal tech. So Legal Geek, for example, is an organisation that organises events and conferences, but also there's quite a lot on their website about what's happening with legal tech, how it's developing, and AI. I'd say if you can go along to networking events, that's another way to find out what information is out there. And things like law schools, in terms of your undergraduate university degrees, they often have networking events and lectures about matters that aren't academic law, but things like legal tech, for example, or the junior lawyers groups. They organise events too, and I think that's really worth going along to. Another website I'm aware of is the Corporate Law Academy. What they do is they take phrases or words or descriptions of corporate deals or corporate matters and tell you in really basic and simplified terms what that actually means. So it's another good place to look if you're really struggling with some of these technical terms that might be unfamiliar to you.
Excellent. And I think with commercial awareness, it's sometimes students, and even I found this when I was a paralegal and a trainee now, it's really hard to develop your commercial awareness when you are, working a full-time job, you're doing training contract applications, or you're studying. And I think it's all about, number one, making it enjoyable, but also trying to absorb information that kind of on the go. So, for example, on my commute to work, I will read kind of short bite newsletters. So there's quite a few good ones by like Finimize, City AM, Watson's Daily. I think there's another one called Little Law as well. And they're all kind of really short bite newsletters that you can read within like 5 to 6 minutes of just key events that are happening that week. And they're really good to expand your commercial awareness. And also, like you said, podcasts, just listening to them on the go to try and absorb that information and then using it at application stages and at interview stages as well. So at IHLS, we are really keen on fostering junior talent, and we take on a lot of interns and paralegals. So how can students and how can those people who may be coming for an interview at IHLS or somewhere else at the beginning of their legal career demonstrate commercial awareness at application stage or at an interview stage?
I think the key is to be prepared. And as you say, if you can spend 5 or 6 minutes here and there, that's going to put you in good stead. There's no point waiting to the night before your interview and suddenly try to delve into the Financial Times, because that just won't get you the level of information you need. It's about having that sort of connection with what's going on in the world, building that up over time. It doesn't have to pervade your entire university studies or whatever level you're at. It's about adding it in small bites here and there. I mean, there's a lot in terms of what should I look at, what kind of topics are hiring managers interested in. And I think you do need to have a look at what is the business or law firm that you're applying to. So, for example, if you're applying to a commercial or corporate law firm, looking at things like what kind of events are shocking the business world is key. So, you mentioned before about, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that caused supply issues across the world. It caused problems with groceries. And those sort of things affect the sort of commercial clients that we might work for. And that's much more relevant to that type of firm than potentially if you're working at a firm that's looking at more sort of litigation, investigatory work. If you're doing that, you might want to have a look at what's going on in that particular industry. So, for example, there's a lot in the press at the moment about SLAPPs. And SLAPPs stand for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation, which are essentially legal threats to silence whistleblowers who raise in the press or in the financial world or in any area, but particularly journalists, to try and silence them when they're sort of uncovering stories. And there's a lot at the moment being looked at by the Solicitors Regulation Authority as to whether that affects things like freedom of speech and the rule of law. So if you're interviewing at a firm like that or filling out an application, knowing what those are, talking about how you think that impacts the people you're speaking to is only going to help you. Again, I think we've spoken about it on other podcasts, but a really current one is the post office scandal. That is pervading all different areas of legal practice in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of procedure for litigation, in terms of the impact on in-house lawyers and the scope of how they get regulated. There's a lot out there written, so it's relatively easy to find online. There's lots of arguments, good arguments for and against what's happening, and making sure the postmasters get their compensation for being wrongly convicted. So there's a lot out there that you can have a look at that's going on, and just trying to look at how it affects the legal profession is what's going to help you.
And what would you say, Lauren, are 3 current hot topics on commercial awareness that you would recommend students brush up on?
So my top 3 topics would be, firstly, AI and legal tech. I think that's something that is going to span across most of the legal profession. There's lots of discussions about whether robots will replace lawyers, and the general feeling is that overall it won't, but it will make lawyers' lives more efficient. So knowing about what developments there are in tech, how it's helping businesses improve, whether it is in fact making differences to the job market and potentially changing the scope of jobs. I don't think there'll be fewer jobs, but potentially there'll be more jobs in things like legal optimization, in implementing legal tech and understanding what that means for lawyers. And also quite a lot of people really enjoy learning about developments in AI. People who've got ChatGPT on their phones or they're using it, it's a hot topic. So that was my first one. A second one will be looking at the wider geopolitical events on the world, whether it's elections, whether it's wars. So we've talked already about the invasion into Ukraine. There's also the war in the Middle East, which again, big political events will always affect what businesses do around the world. So I would always have a look at what are the big picture facing the world leaders at that particular time. And then the final one would be to have a look at politics closer to home. Have a look at what the government's doing in terms of new legislation. Have a look at what's in the pipeline. If there's something like a general election coming up, have a look at what the different parties are suggesting that they will do in terms of implementing new laws, and whether or not they will continue if the main party in power changes. So they would be my top three.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for your time today. I know that the students, whoever's listening to this, University of Law students, will find this really beneficial, and I'm sure they'll be keen to listen to this for any applications or interviews that they have coming up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Merseyside Junior Lawyers Division podcast, which has been kindly sponsored by the University of Law.